I'd like to welcome everyone to this special event during Interfaith Week in the United Kingdom. The event's being organised by two organisations who have been cooperating over many years. That is the British chapter of the International Association for Religious Freedom and also the World Congress of Faiths. For those that don't know, or maybe not know the other organisation, the IARF was formed in 1900, inspired by the Parliament of the World Religions in 1893. The IARF's goal is to open communication between those of various faiths around the world and to increase fellowship and cooperation, particularly on the more liberal orientation. The World Congress of Faiths, again, draws individuals from all the major faith traditions in the world. And they have publications, events, conferences, and it's about promoting understanding of the importance of spiritual life in our communities and society and the recognition of its benefits. So I think we're very pleased to be working together. Our theme today is around that religions have different origins, development pathways, belief systems, and spiritualities. There remains a possibility of a family resemblance between them. This tension or ambiguity is inherent in the dynamic of the particularity as opposed to what is universal. So we explore these, we argue of them, and we negotiate these through interreligious dialogue. So our speaker tonight is going to rehearse some of the factors involved in how the reality of religious experience might be related to the demands and outcomes of dialogue. So our speaker is the Reverend Canon Dr. Alan Race. He is chair of the World Congress of Faiths and editor of its journal, Interreligious Insight. He's a retired Anglican priest-theologian and the author of many, many books and articles on the themes of theology of religions and interreligious dialogue. His most recent book is My Journey as a Religious Pluralist in 2021. So welcome, Alan.
Well, thank you for mentioning my book there, my journey book, I call it. It costs £20 on Amazon. I'll give you it for £10. That's the end of the commercial. But it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I appreciate very much the IARF extending the hand of friendship to the World Congress of Faith for this talk. As you've said, both organizations began life in the first half of the 20th century, though I think IARF is the senior partner by about 3 decades or so. Some might call this an instance of age gap love. I'll leave that with you. In those 3 decades, of course, the world was beginning to open up hugely through trade and travel and knowledge of many kinds, including religious knowledge. Religions exist, as we know, to promote liberation, salvation, enlightenment. We use different words. But what happens when there's a clash of liberations, salvations, enlightenments? I once gave a talk to a gathered audience, at the front of which were religious leaders from sort of various traditions. And in my opening remarks, I said, all religions seem to reserve a corner of the mind for the eventual superiority of their religion. Well, the faces of all these religious leaders all broke out into a broad smile. They'd recognized the impact of my observation. The business of self-determination at the heart of the philosophy of freedom has been hard won, but it has ethical limits. So we're not free to hate or to harm others. But what do we then do with that corner of the mind which has encouraged hate and harm and even killing of the one who is different? This is where freedom from might be balanced by freedom for. And I was pleased to see this as one of the IARF's goals at the recent conference in Romania. See, I've done a bit of homework, which asks the question, what role can religious leaders and people of faith play in reconciliation? So when we come to the theme of reconciliation, how does this apply to religion? So I want to come at this question via reflection on the notion of religious experience and interreligious dialogue, which then leads into the theology of religions debate. Freedom from hate and harm and freedom for reconciliation is, I believe, ultimately a question of how we develop a theology of religious diversity. But anyway, let me begin at the experience end of things, and I'm going to do it slightly by a sideways look. You can put up the slide in a minute, Derek. So I begin with an example of religious experience from literature. And I'm thinking here of a moment from the novel The Bell by the philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch. You don't have to have read it all. It's a bit old now anyway, but it's a wonderful book. One of the central characters, Dora, had come upon a painting by Gainsborough in London's National Gallery, and you can see it on the slide there. There was a painting of two children chasing a butterfly. But Iris Murdoch herself described it like this. Described, that's to say, the account of it in her book, The Bell. She says, Dora was always moved by the pictures. Today she was moved, but in a new way. She marveled with a kind of gratitude that they were all still here, and her heart was filled with love for the pictures, their authority, their marvelous generosity, their splendor. It occurred to her that here at last was something real and something perfect. She felt that she had had a revelation. She looked at the radiant, somber, tender, powerful canvas of Gainsborough and felt a sudden desire to go down on her knees before it, embracing it, shedding tears. Well, that was Iris Murdoch commenting on her own passage. Dora has had a religious experience. In her commentary further on the passage, Murdoch explains there are such experiences, like Dora's, where it's appropriate to think that the word truth is in place. She says the discovery of truth is the discovery of good, and this may be an experience of revelation. This cloud of cobwebs can be swept away by an experience of art or of nature, an experience of talking to somebody or seeing somebody working. What's at stake, Murdoch explains, is that experiences of exaltation present, and I quote, an image of the death of egoism. Religion, she says, is about the death of the ego. Well, interestingly, others have said the same, and I'm thinking now particularly of the philosopher and theologian of pluralism, interreligious pluralism, John Hick. Echoing Iris Murdoch, Hick also proposed that the death of the ego is indeed a universal theme across the religions, and he famously made it central to his own philosophy. Murdoch espoused a naturalist interpretation of religious experience, but John Hick embraced a more transcendental interpretation. But for both experiences of the Dora kind, they're valid as a locus of truth. But they clearly take many forms, and here I give you sort of two clusters of forms. First of all, there's non-specific reports of being caught up in a sense of increased well-being, or oneness with the total environment involving nature or human relationships, and stretching beyond the time-bound limitations we call normal existence, and often accompanied by feelings of compassion and joy and self-giving. Or more kind of religiously, if you like, reports of transcendent experience in specific settings of particular sacred traditions, as answers to prayer or experiences of personalities, Krishna or Jesus, or Buddha, and so on. And we move here towards the more mystical accounts of traditional religion. Talk of transcending the ego in alignment with an eternal realm. In theistic traditions, we could cite examples of the love poetry of, say, Christian mystics, where mystical experience is likened to a marriage between the soul and God. Or in the unitive traditions, there are expressive sayings such as, I am Brahman, that one, for example, by Shankara, from the Advaitic non-dual Hindu tradition. So that's just a couple of examples of sort of clusters of things which are different when you examine them individually, but nevertheless form a kind of cluster. And the standard problem in philosophy of religion is how to classify all this material and ascertain what truth-telling value, Iris Murdoch, John Hick, it might have. In other words, whether or not it really does tell us something about the nature of that transcendent reality which the religiously committed believes encompasses our world. For the philosophical skeptic, of course, the great variety of material that exists is evidence of not very much. But, the skeptic continues, it's more likely to be simply a function of the brain or of genetic factors. On the other hand, there's strong grounds for thinking that while consciousness is not possible without the brain, that doesn't mean that consciousness is simply the brain at work. In relation to religious experience, reported impressions and experiences need not be reduced to chemical releases in the brain or delusory forms of awareness. All of that is intensely controversial, of course. Given that there is a seeming contradictory mass of reports, the task of distinguishing between all of them being true, or some of them being true, or none of them being true, seems a pretty gargantuan undertaking. Mm. But it's at this point, I believe, that interreligious dialogue enters the picture. For religious experience to be of any value, interpreters need to be sensitive to a whole range of expressed experiences in many contexts. Therefore, the first challenge is how to take seriously religious experiences in our multi-faith context. Each tradition, of course, asserts the authenticity and truth of its own core experience. This entails that we trust that what is offered through a tradition of experience is worthy of attention. That said, we don't have to trust that everything that's being perpetrated by a tradition is acceptable. Critical studies have revealed how structural beliefs through the ages have perpetuated, many negative things, we might say, scientific denialism or patriarchy or religious violence. But in relation to basic experience, it seems reasonable enough to agree what I call some terms of trust across the board. But any newly established space of trust between religions is characterized by two opposing pulls, and Derek mentioned these in his introduction. The pull of belonging together. Traditions can relate by a virtue of, say, the model of family resemblance. Each of us is about some sense of transcendent vision and human transformation. We belong, if you like, on the same page. Opposite to that is the pull of differences. Traditions do display characteristically different experiences, together with their culturally conceptual differences in architecture and philosophy and so on. And that leads to incomprehension often and strangeness, wondering whether communication between them seems possible. So in these circumstances, what's needed is a model of understanding that reflects this tension at the heart of trust. And this model is dialogue. And I want to turn to that now. Dialogue, I suggest, involves truly viewing one another as, in some sense, mutually accountable. And mutual accountability signals a desire that participants learn from one another, and as they do that learning, they will be caught up, I believe, in a process involving 3 levels. And Derek will now put these on a slide. Very simply, I just give a list of 3 levels of dialogue, which I call learning about the other, learning with the other, and learning through the other. So it's about, with, and through. And in order to elucidate this further, I'm going to outline a processive model for dialogue by way of an extended comment on each of the 3 levels. There they are. We got them on the screen now. So the first one, just called learning about. And don't forget, this is inspired by a notion of religious experience. So all religions are founded on a basic religious vision, which is glimpsed in experience. It may be focused in a book, a person, sacred stories, or nature, maybe other things too. And in turn, the spiritual practices and beliefs of a tradition exist to represent that basic vision for different times and places. The aim is to reproduce the evocative awareness of living in the presence of what we can call generically the sacred. In dialogue, we want to learn about the reality and the meaning of the sacred across the board with in relation to others. And learning about the others, not simply a matter of acquiring textbook knowledge. So this was evident in one example of dialogue between a Jewish rabbi and a Jain monk. Rabbi Rami Mark Shapiro recalls being brought up sharp by the strangeness to him of his Jain counterpart. And he reports that being brought up sharp like this. A Jain monk was explaining that in his tradition, the soul is fundamentally independent and on its own. There's no union with God or connection with other beings. Those of us in attendance did our best to rework what the monk was saying so that it more closely matched our own teachings about unity and unification. But try as we might, the integrity of our dialogue refused to permit us to pretend to some agreement that was not in fact there. And then the next slide, Derek, if we can do that, are the words where Mark Shapiro carried on. At this point, it dawned on me. I began to laugh. I laughed as an expression of something awakening. I laughed as the idol of a false unity was toppled and the wonder of diversity was affirmed. I laughed with joy at our different paths and the fundamental pathlessness of truth. That's a key quotation there. Hold on to it. Well, 2 points emerge for me from this account. First of all, the forlornness of trying to reinterpret the unfamiliar in terms familiar to one's own tradition. We all do it, but how far do we get with it? But second, that arresting phrase, pathlessness of truth, seems to capture an insight that the reality or truth to which religious consciousness points lies beyond explanations and theologies. Regardless, I think there's another slide coming up. Derek, here we are. Regardless of Jainism and Judaism, continues the rabbi, regardless of sutras and scriptures, regardless of all the words spent on explaining our differences, there was in fact common ground. The here and now, dialogue, sharing that we were involved in made a greater statement of truth than any doctrine we might take up and examine. There was something in the act of listening, of speaking, of taking the other to heart that opened my heart to ineffable wonder. Well, I think the telling term here is ineffable wonder. It means that once we realize that all traditions recognize the inadequacy of human language in describing ultimate truth, we've become open to the possibility of religious truth in different religious disguises. But the question now arises, do interpreted religious experiences stem from a common source? We're not able to demonstrate this without reservation, or in order to say they do spring from the same source, one would have to demonstrate they exhibit sufficient overlap in their contents, and that's not readily obvious. However, there are theoretical observations that state that while religions do appear to be on the surface incommensurable with each other, this doesn't mean there are no compatibilities. Analysis shows that the major core experience of one tradition may be reflected in others as a kind of minor key in varying degrees and across traditions which seem at first sight wholly incompatible. So Semitic traditions do exhibit Indic, I'm using these terms, do exhibit Indic mystical elements, and Indic traditions exhibit interest in Semitic prophetic witness as a minor element in their whole outlook. So you have kind of major and minor keys within the traditions. And this observation, I think, is to be expected if the family resemblance theory between religions that was mentioned earlier has validity. So my example of Jain-Jewish encounter at the dialogical level of learning about one another demonstrates that while there are characteristic Jain and Jewish experiences, basic ones, how to make sense of the variety of experiences within an overall religious account remains an open question, not a closed down question. This takes us to level 2 on the dialogue journey, which I called learning with. As dialogue progresses, we achieve, I think, a state of sort of parallel acceptance. The religious experience of the other has demonstrated its worth, and we want to know what it is we might learn from one another that is beyond the objectivization of the other. And this triggers, I think, a search for any structural comparability between traditions as fields of experience. So I'm going to cite, from some years ago now, but I think extremely valid still, one example of such structural comparability by way of illustration. So, following 2 years of prolonged dialogical listening and exchange, members of what became known as the Snowmass Monastic Dialogue Group, it was held in Colorado in the USA, involving various traditions. I'll list them for you: Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Islamic, Native American, various Christian ones, Russian Orthodox, Protestant, and Roman Catholics. They all consolidated their learning into a number of points of agreement. Although those agreements were published first as a simple list, I'm going to arrange them here in a diagram form in a bid to sort of sharpen up what I'm calling a structural common cycle a religious life between them. And we're on to the next slide now, Derek. Good. Now you start in the top right-hand column. The group said that the experience of ultimate reality, comes through all world traditions, and they listed a few there. It's generated by virtue of the human awareness of living in an environment capable of being responded to religiously. But moving on to B, our access to transcendence is through our human openness that we call faith or trust, better word, I think, which, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith observed, is the human capacity to feel, to know, to live at more than a mundane level and in relation to transcendence. And in the light of the experience of transcendence through faith, we realize that salvation, liberation, enlightenment involves a struggle between the negative and positive pulls as we seek spiritual goals in life. And that's at point C. And you can see the potential for wholeness on the right, but also what we experience in life is our separation from ultimate reality and its manifestations. But in the light of the experience of transcendence through faith, I've already said that, through that struggle we enter into and are potentially, to a degree, find some resolution maybe through a disciplined practice and spiritual life. And that in turn leads us into E, that religious awareness leads us to deepen our sense that ultimate reality is infinitely richer than one person or one tradition's grasp of it. So deepening our sense of ultimate reality is always a journey, hence the arrow goes off to the right and we go around the circle again. With this kind of diagram, in dialogical terms, we've moved from learning about the other to valuing the other as a partner. We're both pursuing transcendent vision and human transformation. In other words, we move to learning with or alongside others. Yet again, as in level 1, there's the reflective business of discerning what holds us together and what keeps us apart as human beings committed to the religious quest. The snowmass experiment does not assume that the representatives of the traditions are experiencing or reporting the same phenomenon. But it did lead the Trappist monk, Thomas Keating, who died a number of years ago now, the initiator of the dialogue, to ask this: are there truths on which the religions of the world are in substantial agreement? Having listened, he continued, to the masters of other traditions, and convinced that underlying the particular conceptual frames of reference is a unity, and then here's the phrase, that has never been sufficiently grasped. Never been sufficiently grasped. If this is a foretaste of transcendental unity, it will be one based on the experience of dialogue itself. And it'll not be a unity of each experiencing the same experience, as it were, yet reporting it simply in different words. But the fruits of the snowmass dialogue, I think, make a prima facie case for and pointer towards transcendental interreligious unity. What emerges for me from the snowmass report is that it suggests the need for a distinction between, on the one hand, ultimate reality as the grounds of what it called infinite potentiality and actualization. Sorry, fairly kind of formal terms here, a bit abstract. On the one hand, and then on the other, the named gods or sacred divine principles. On the other, Allah, God, absolute, the Great Spirit, and so on. And this is a crucial distinction, of course, in all mystical religion and in all traditions. From it, the next question follows. How then does the mystery of ultimate reality relate to any image of God glimpsed through humanly experienced means? The answer is usually given in terms of a concept of revelation or realization or some other term. But I think we have to recognize that revelation is a matter of creative and voluntary receptivity in human experience with all its limitations and colorings. In other words, it's a kind of non-coercive thing, a voluntary action, a voluntary receptivity. And once this non-coercive aspect about the notion of revelation is taken seriously, then it allows for variety and plurality in the naming of ultimate reality, because you have to take account of who says what and where they exist and what history they've come from. We require a theory that does justice both to the ineffability of ultimate reality and those variously named ideas of it arising from that which is experienced and then affirmed and shared through dialogue. Religious worlds are in some sense parallel worlds, but once we've accepted the religious authenticity of the different apprehensions at the heart of the parallel worlds, we become, I think, dissatisfied with stagnant parallelism, as I've called it. So the further question arises, is it possible to move beyond even this parallelism in dialogue? And this brings us to level 3, learning through. And again, it's best illustrated, I think, with an example. So I'm going to call upon a dialogue between, well, two women who are no longer with us, but whose words live on. A dialogue between the Roman Catholic, Rosemary Radford Ruther, and Rita Gross, a Buddhist. Ruther outlines what she learned centrally from Buddhism in relation to the concept of God, and I'll just read this. It's not on the screen. Whatever I call God, this is in her dialogue with Buddhism, is not some ontological being, some ultimate mind, existing invisibly in disembodied form beyond the world. Rather, what exists is this very creativity of interdependent co-arising, very Buddhist term, out of which all the interrelated phenomena of contingently existing reality burgeon forth and coexist with each other, returning ultimately into the void to arise in new forms. So that's quite sort of a mouthful to take in, but I think in general terms you might say things arise and things fall away and belong to the void. So with these kind of reflections, we might ask, what prevents Rosemary Ruther from becoming a Buddhist? What she affirms seems closer to Buddhism than to classical theism. However, what Ruther's mainly objecting to in classical theism is a certain kind of caricature of God as a super person, residing externally to the world and who intervenes in it from time to time in order to adjust the flow of events. In fact, most responsible theistic theologians have long surrendered that caricature, actually, if they ever held it in the first place. But it has to be said that the classical theism finds it hard to shake off all of the caricature that it has in Ruther's radical fashion. So what can we say about this kind of learning through Buddhism in Ruther's case? 2 points can be made, I think, that keeps her recognizably Christian. First of all, in referring to another book, in the Christian-Buddhist conversation between Roger Haight, Christian, and Paul Nitter, a self-confessed dual belonger but Buddhist for our purposes, it became clear that even Orthodox Christian belief could resonate with Buddhist belief in non-dualism. The dialoguers both celebrated the notion of God as specified by the medieval Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas. They said this: Aquinas' notion of God is that of being itself, that is, empty of any limiting form, pure energy with no definition, no thing, pure emptiness that is not negative but unimaginably creative, dynamism and vitality. God, the within of all finite being. Well, it's a bit more abstract thought there. But Ruther's valuing of the Buddhist creativity of interdependent co-arising, I think, would surely be at home with Aquinas on this crucial affirmation of the meaning of God. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, although the languages of Buddhist and Christian vision might seem far apart, there's no reason for imagining that there's an either-or choice remaining between them. A favourite of mine, Perry Schmidt-Leukel, has said the following: I suggest that neither the similarities nor the differences between Buddhism and Christianity can be neatly segregated. There are no well-demarcated areas of identical assertions on the one side and clear-cut differences on the other. He goes further. It may be that the basic experiences at the heart of both traditions do indeed spring from a supreme reality that forms the ultimate concern of both traditions. And this is on the next slide, Derek. No, I'm nearly done. There may be forms of existence in relation to the ultimate that are different, but nevertheless equally valid as different expressions of salvation, liberation. This can be so in view of the fact that this relation always concerns the existence of finite human beings, whereas the only all-encompassing reality is not found in any religious doctrine or narrative, but is the infinite ultimate reality itself, always exceeding that which can be caught in our conceptual webs. I did put a little web they could see. I don't know whether that's there. So, oh, there we are. There's your web. So Ruther can still be a Christian, but with absorbed dimensions of Buddhism now as part of her spiritual quest. I'm saying this is a case of learning through the other. Right, one final set of things to say very quickly. How does my three-leveled outline to dialogue add up, both as a process of interaction between people and even as a new way of approaching questions of religious truth? For me, it leads inescapably to a pluralist type view, which is built up in the following steps very quickly. 1, we trust our religious experience is a virtue that can be shared by all traditions, leading to dialogue. 2, dialogue between people is this process of learning about, with, and through the other. And 3, the distinction between the ineffability of ultimate reality and its awareness in concrete forms accounts for both the resonance and the strangeness existing between religious commitments as these are played out in dialogue. And 4, religious experiences are shaped by conceptual histories and social contexts and so on, and are therefore refractions in time and space of that hidden common ground within which all reality is to be approached and interpreted. My aim in this talk has been to describe how this is not simply an exercise in abstracted theology, but arises from the dynamics shaping the processes of interreligious dialogue itself. Are we still there? Yes, we are. And I would venture to suggest that while religious freedom underpins the idea and practice of dialogue, religious freedom finds its most interesting outcome in a theory of religious pluralism. There's the tricky bit. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm sure that will raise lots of comment and questions, which we've agreed to take.
To get stuck into.
Yes. So there are 22 of us, so I think we can be fairly relaxed about how we manage Q&A. So if you either want to use the reaction feature to raise your hand, or wave your hand and unmute yourself, I think we can all be adult about this, I hope. So does anyone have...
Can I remain unmuted? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. So does anyone...
questions? It could be comments or their own experiences, of course, to share, and so on.
Well, maybe I could start with one, Alan.
Okay.
Many religious traditions have a very close relationship with a particular nationality, ethnic group, political group around the world, and are and often driven then into violence in support of that group. What would be your response to that, in terms of people saying the religion is so intrinsically linked to the ethnic group or language group that I'm part of?
I think you're right. If you look around the world, that's mostly the case. But at the same time, if you look around the world, that's becoming kind of less the case. That's to say that particular language groups and religions are kind of intrinsically linked and only linked in that kind of way. It's also true, I think, that so religions are spreading out that way all over the place. There are people in different language groups being Buddhists or Christians or Muslims and so on. So in a way, some of that hiding behind walls is beginning to break down. Now, we're only, I think, at the very beginning of all that, even though some of us have been trying to be at it for quite a while. In general terms, there's still a long way to go. But I think what I'm trying to outline here is that, think of that Rami Mark Shapiro thing, that, I hear someone explaining their tradition and it seems utterly kind of odd and strange and has no reference to it, the kind of things that I've been brought up with or that I kind of value and cherish. And then it dawns on him, and it's quite fun because he bursts out in laughter, that, it's kind of not right to assume that that's what is expected of our encounters or our dialogues or our thought patterns, that we should all, as it were, be the same and be immediately conversant with one another across languages and histories and so on. You have to kind of work at it, but one can rejoice at that sense of kind of difference as a new locus for trying to come to terms with what religious truth might be and what religious understanding might be. Now,
thank you, Alan.
At the same time, I'll just say about the violence, all traditions have been at it in one form or another. We think some have been less at it than others, maybe, but don't think anyone is kind of free from the accusation. So in that sense, there's a lot of work to do, I think, to unpick that sort of business of religions being tied to particular kinds of languages. So, again, now we've embarked on a different kind of journey in this century and thereafter of trying to expand the kind of, you might say exclusivism or the enclosedness that a tradition seems to have attracted to itself, and to expand and climb over all of those walls Violence is not actually what the religions really are founded to promote, of course not. And they come about because of all the various factors that we know about in life. Unfortunately, religion either sponsors it or at best has been a bit powerless to kind of do much about that. But I think we're beginning to see that that's the case and that something needs to be done about it. We've got IARF, WCF, we've also got Religions for Peace. And these are what we need to be promoting now.
Thank you. And I see Jonathan Roberts' hand up. You unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alan.
Hello.
A very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Just a question, the usual kind of classification of approaches to different religions, and you hinted at it in your response just there, is the kind of exclusive, inclusive, and pluralist approaches. Yeah. I know they're very rough and broad categories, but I mean, you said that your understanding of dialogue would lead you to embrace a pluralist approach. Does it inevitably lead to that, or are there still ways through to perhaps a broad inclusive approach or even a broad exclusive approach?
There are those who argue that, but I'm afraid I'm not one of them. Of course, it's possible, and this is what I think where we've arrived at now. Most of us don't want to, as it were, dismiss the different other. Most of us have learned in, put it like this, kind of modern democratic times, that there's no future in the world without some kind of basic respect and some basic collaboration, some working together on, on the world's difficulties, on our own perceptions about those things. So we have a situation where the dialogue is about collaboration, you might say, and is most fruitful in practical senses. I'm absolutely in favor of practical dialogue and fruitfulness. But what I'm trying to say in this talk, that if you really want to kind of go deeper than that, notice my phrase, what was it, a kind of parallelism, a kind of, I can't remember the phrase I use now anyway, but it was something to do with parallelism, that I'm not sure that takes fully account of what's being learned and pursued through dialogue. The questions always at the end of the day, it seems to me, in the dialogue world, is, how are we going to interpret the plurality that is our world, both from the business of observing it and then from the business of, as it's finding out from one's own tradition and then in dialogue with other traditions, what that amounts to and how it might be. I sometimes use this story. A number of years ago, I was part of a gathering between Hindus and Christians. It was held in Lambeth Palace, so it was a fairly kind of high up thing. And the agenda was, how can we work together, better together, for the sake of an improved world? And a very kind of valid task. About halfway through the day, there was a young man from the Hindu world who put his hand up and shouted out, "Archbishop," there was an archbishop somewhere around, Archbishop, I'm all in favor of collaboration between us. That's a wonderful thing. But what I really want to know is what you make of my religion. What I really want to know is that. So every encounter, it seems to me, leads to that kind of question. We can put it on the side, leave it in brackets if we like, and lots of people do, many dialogue groups do, but those which are wanting to push the boat a bit further, take that young Hindu man's question, I want to know what you think of my tradition. Take that more seriously.
Wow, thank you. Jody Bell?
Thank you very much.
Mine's just a comment, really. I was thinking about the work that's been done at Johns Hopkins on religious experience, mainly through the use of psychedelics. They've been looking at the therapeutic use of psychedelics, and then they did a thing with religious participants, and I think the results are just being published at the moment, and I'm not quite sure where they've got. But presumably the integration process happened amongst all those who are involved. So that involved a rabbi, a priest, quite a lot of different participants. And it would be very interesting to know how far they've got in that process. I mean, I have got a friend who was involved with it, so I'd be quite interested to ask him, whether they got to this point, because they were quite randomly selected, I think, for the experiment, just to see if they had experiences that they could share. I mean, anyway, your talk raised that question for me. I thought I must find out the answer.
You must, and then come back and tell us.
Yeah.
Of course, there is quite a lot, and I'm not sure I know too much about this, but there's quite a lot of experiments that have been done in relation to I don't know whether this is the same thing you're talking about, Georgie, in relation to, say, Hindu monks or Buddhist monks and so in meditation, being wired up to equipment that can measure various brain waves going on as they undertake this meditation for an hour or whatever it is. And
yes, I don't think that's
with results that sort of say, the mood does change of the person does change, and the receptivity, as it were, of their larger environment, not just their most immediate kind of worldview and so on, but a larger sense of belonging to something greater or something more universal. Use that term if you like. Often, becomes part of their experience within the meditation. And then you get the neuroscientists who'd want to sort of inquire into that further. And then on the one side, you've got, well, these are the kind of synapses doing funny things on the side and, creating these impressions. But then on the other side, you get, well, actually, these could only be reported if there's a sense of human consciousness that is, as it were, noticing them, which is separate from the actual experiences themselves. And that's, I think, where the sort of debate in the kind of neuroscience and religion has kind of got to, and what has been going on for quite some time, and is kind of very interesting. People keep coming into, depending on what side you start off with, you want to make your case for your side. So there's quite a lot of dialogue that needs to happen between those two kinds of groups. Now, that's the only kind of related field that I know just a tiny bit about from what you're saying, I think.
Yes,
I saw Richard.
Sorry.
So you want to respond, Jordan, and then...
No, not really. Thank you. That's...
I mean, if anyone knows more about all these things that we seem to, that would be great.
I'll report back if I get
Yes.
a bit of it. Thank you.
I saw Richard. Did you hand up? Is that right? You're muted, Richard.
Oh, Mr. Tetlow, yes.
Richard, yeah. Oh. There we are.
How's that?
Yes,
good.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, good. I'm interested, Alan, in all the pressures which may be on us, just as human beings. You make at the end reference to the history that we've had. But you didn't mention very much about the psychological factors which have influenced us in our lives. I was a baby in Gaza, along with another 30, and that was my life 20 years ago. Whatever, whatever background we have, however awful or grand. And related to that, therefore, is the social setting in which we were, in terms of poverty and wealth and freedom and education. And in my experience of, for those who won't know me, I began life as a social caseworker. I taught social casework at university, and then I became a priest, etc. And now I retired, and I work particularly with two interfaith groups in Birmingham. Yeah, and in all the different people met, those social factors and the personal factors have been absolutely basic, on top of my own family and their personal ways and their personal behavior and thinking. And therefore, the question seems to me to come down to what actual pressures affect different people in different ways and why, and how they come out in terms of what is most important in terms of how we live, our plurality, our friendships, whatever.
Sure, of course. I mean, I think that's bound to be the case. I think there is quite a lot, I think, of analysis of, take, for example, why does the far right in this country, take itself to those kind of demonstrations on Remembrance Tide in London and, cause some havoc. What's going on in their background or in their perceptions that, wants a certain, wants a kind of hatred to be voiced. And there might be lots of different factors, mightn't there? There'll be social ones, employment ones, there'll be political education they have or haven't had, there'll be the impression that they get from various leaders or politicians or groupings around the world, and so on. I mean, these are all kind of factors that do determine human behavior. But at the same time, presumably we ought to say that we're not kind of just purely victims of our circumstances. There is some sense of religious, or some sense of human freedom rather. However, circumscribed all of that is through historical and cultural factors. But if we believe that there is some sense of consciousness that is allied to a sense of freedom, then we have the ability to A, understand some of that, and B, kind of rise above it where it's needed. And those are factors to understand, I would have thought, just when people come together in dialogue or collaboration or encounter one kind or another. Isn't that right? That
doesn't it actually mean that the weighing up of those different priorities is basic? It's not a small extra at the end of this discussion. It's absolutely fundamental to why we think and believe it, etc., as we do. And that relates as much to my deciding to be a priest and not becoming a priest. That was a kind of transcendental experience, of where it came from, etc., in my setting is very important.
Sure.
Right.
And the same for me. But I mean, I happen to know this for everyone else on the screen, Richard, have been on your own journey about what your humanity and your priesthood, you mentioned, is all about, what it's meant and how it's practiced and how you think about it now. You've changed your mind about a number of things. So have I. It wasn't until, I went to university in Bradford, and this was the early 1970s when immigration was beginning to happen on a kind of bigger scale. That the business of, who are these other people that look different but also seem to behave different from me? What are they about? So that begins a different kind of human journey in the light of those kind of experiences. So I moved from being totally ignorant about all that to actually informing myself about it. And presumably, that's partly an educational thing that needs to happen. It's also the responsibility of each traditions that it should happen, and the leaders and the educators and so on in those traditions. Now, we might be in a time when there's not a lot of enthusiasm for that, enough enthusiasm. We know there are many groups around this country, for example, that come together for sharing experiences and mutual learning and so on. That just seems to me needs to increase. Of course, we're all unwoke in various ways, Richard, to use that term. I think dialogue is, maybe we should say that's just a movement for waking up.
We have time for one brief comment question. Anyone? Oh, Peter Godfrey, is that a hand up? Yes, it is.
Yes,
Go ahead. Final one.
Some comments rather than questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one thing that perhaps we have to bear in mind is that we talk about Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, but these aren't unities. So often the immense varieties within them. We talk about dialogue. You see, I can remember in my longish career as a Unitarian minister, on one occasion, getting somebody from one faith to come to a discussion and asking somebody else in the same faith to come. And he said, "Oh, no, I can't come if that other person's taking part." There's immense difficulties in that respect. And then there's a question of dialogue at different levels. At the top, where you get bishops and archbishops, at the local levels with the churches. All of these, I think, are important. Last week, I was in a group at Oxford where we had a wonderful talk by Wendy Fiddler. Some of you may have heard of Wendy. Absolutely wonderful. And she was stressing getting together and just chatting, beginning at that level. And I think really there's a lot to be said that if we can do it, I hope we can. And the talk this evening has been encouraging in that respect. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you,
Alan. And of course we need to, this talk is to mark Interfaith Week, and all around the country in cities and towns there are innumerable events by the host of different organizations and churches and faith groups and synagogues, gurdwaras. So I would bring the apologies of one of our IRF members, who many of you may know, Charanjit Singh, who's at a Hounslow Interfaith event this evening that had already been programmed.
He's also World Congress of Faiths.
He's very active and that for many years. Can I'll hand at this point over to another activist in both World Congress of Faiths and the IARF, Pejman Gohashian.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan, for that very informative and interesting talk. I love what you said about, religions moving away from hate, harm, and killing towards reconciliation. That was very interesting there. Then the Bell by Iris Murdoch, that was good. You talked about, the death of the ego. That was very good for all of us. Not thinking that our religion is the best, the only valid one, or the most up-to-date one. So, but that's good. And then you talked about the 3 levels. Learning about each other, learning with each other, and learning through each other. I think I agree here. I think we can move on, what I would say, from conflict and war, prejudice and discrimination, but at least what I would say is tolerance of each other. But then there's, as you quite rightly said, there's scope for us to move beyond from tolerance to understanding, respect, and ultimately trust. So by that, I will bring this talk to an end. Derek, is that okay?
Thank you, and thank you, Alan, again, and thank you to everyone who attended.